Friends, before I tell you about the winter that changed Stillwater Hollow forever, let me tell you about a woman named Mercy Kohler. She taught me something I've carried with me for 40 years. She taught me that the strongest walls a woman builds are not always made of stone. Settle in. Pour yourself something warm. This is going to take a while. It was January of 1884, Montana Territory, the kind of cold that gets inside your bones and stays there. Mercy Kohler was 35 years old that winter. She had hair the color of wheat in October, brown eyes that had seen too much, and hands that never stopped working. She'd been a school teacher once before she married Silas. Back when she still believed words could change the world, she didn't believe that anymore. The cabin they lived in was made of pine boards Silas had cut himself 2 summers earlier. It was a fine cabin, tight joints, good roof, the kind of place a man could be proud of in September. But it was January now, and January did not care about pride. The wind came down off the Bitterroot Range like it had something personal against the Kohler family. It found every gap, every seam, every place where wood had shrunk away from wood. Mercy could hear it whispering through the walls like a stranger trying to get in. She had stuffed rags in every crack she could find, 4 times that night already. The rags never stayed. The cold always found another way. Little Elspeth was coughing again. Mercy sat on the edge of the bed where her daughter slept, under 3 wool blankets. The girl was 7 years old and small for her age. She had been small since the winter before, when something had gotten into her lungs and never quite left. Some nights she breathed easy. Most nights she didn't. Mercy put her hand on the child's forehead. Cool. Thank God. But the cough kept coming. That dry, scraping cough that meant the cold air was finding her chest again. Mercy hummed a song her own mother used to hum. A song from Pennsylvania, from a different life, from a time when she was a girl named Mercy Holloway, and she still believed her future was going to be a kind one. She didn't sing the words. She didn't trust her voice. Because Mercy Kohler had a secret she had never spoken out loud, not even to Silas. 2 winters ago, between Thaddeus and Elspeth, she had carried another child. A boy, she was sure of it, though no one could have told. She had lost him in November of 1881, on a night when the wind sounded just like this. She had been alone in the cabin when it happened. Silas was gone hauling stone for a man in Helena. Thaddeus was only 8. She had buried what she could behind the old cottonwood and never told a soul. She never blamed Silas, not out loud. But there were nights like this one when she looked at her husband sleeping in the next room, and she wondered if she still knew him, if she still trusted him, if she still believed the choices he made for their family were the right ones. That's a hard thing to admit, friends. That's the kind of thing a woman carries silently for years. Elspeth coughed again. Hard. Mercy reached for the rag pile and started pushing fresh strips into the gap above the window. The cold came right through her fingers. Outside, the cottonwoods cracked in the dark like rifle shots. Behind her, Silas was awake. He had been awake for a long time. He didn't say anything. He just watched her work. His big hands lay open on the blanket like he didn't know what to do with them. In the corner, the dog Copper raised his head and looked at Mercy with those soft brown eyes that always knew more than they should. Then he settled back down beside the iron stove. The stove was working as hard as it could. The metal groaned from the heat. Silas had fed it 3 loads in the last hour. But the warmth never traveled. It stayed close to the iron, and the rest of the cabin belonged to winter. Mercy sat back down beside Elspeth. The child had stopped coughing. Her small chest rose and fell, and Mercy whispered into the dark words she had never said before. She whispered, "I don't think we can do another winter like this one." Silas heard her. She knew he heard her, but he didn't answer. He turned his face toward the wall and pretended to be asleep. That was Silas, a man who heard everything and answered with silence. Outside, the wind kept on. And somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, Mercy made a decision. She didn't know it yet. She wouldn't recognize it until weeks later. But something inside her shifted that night. Something that said, I will not lose another child to this cabin. Now, friends, before we go on, let me ask you something. If you have ever sat by a sick child's bed in the middle of the night, listening to them breathe, praying, the morning would come faster. I want you to do something for me. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. What town? What state? I want to know who's keeping me company. Because Mercy's story is for you, and I think you already know that. Now let me tell you what happened that spring. The thaw came late that year. Montana doesn't give up winter easy. The creeks ran black under the last of the ice until almost April. But finally the wagon ruts turned to mud, and the meadowlarks came back, and a person could stand outside without their breath catching in their throat. Silas Kohler was 38 years old. He was a stonemason by trade. He had a quiet way about him that some people mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He was a man who had learned young that the world rewards the people who watch before they act. His father had taught him that. A man named Heinrich Kohler, who had come over from a German village whose name nobody in Montana could pronounce. Heinrich had built lime kilns in the Colorado foothills before he died. Silas had been 19 the day the kiln wall collapsed. 19 years old, standing in the dust, holding his father's hat. Silas didn't talk about that day. Not to Mercy, not to anyone. But there was a thing his father had said to him the spring before he died. He had taken Silas out before dawn to the kiln where the fire had been burning the night before. The fire was cold now. The bricks were dark. Heinrich had put his son's hand against the outside wall. Stone remembers my boy. Stone remembers everything we give it. Silas had been 17 then. He had not understood. He thought his father was being poetic. Heinrich was sometimes like that. But 21 years later, in the spring of 1884, riding back from town with $247 in his coat pocket, every cent the family had, Silas Kohler finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him. He understood it because the night before, his wife had whispered in the dark that she didn't think they could do another winter. And he had not been able to answer her, because he was afraid she was right. The land he bought was 3 miles east of Stillwater Hollow, a long, low rise above a creek called Mossback. The rise had nothing on it but sagebrush and the crumbling ruins of an old frontier fort. The fort had been abandoned for 20 years. The walls were 24 inches thick, stone mostly, with ancient lime mortar that had turned to powder in the joints. Wendell Marsh, the man who owned the sawmill, was also the one who handled the deed at the land office. Stillwater Hollow was a small town. A man often wore 2 hats. Wendell was 45 and built like a fence post. He stared at Silas across the counter for a long time before he spoke. You're buying the old fort? Yes, sir. You know there is nothing on it but stones. Yes, sir. Wendell shook his head slowly. Kohler, I've got a whole lumber yard. Fresh pine, best in the basin. You could be in a new cabin by August. I know it. Then what in God's name? Silas just set the money down on the counter. Wendell counted it twice. He gave Silas the deed. And as Silas turned to leave, Wendell said the words that would travel halfway across Montana by supper time. He said, "That man has lost his mind." The news reached Mercy before Silas did. She was at the general store buying flour when she heard 2 women whispering behind the dry goods. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. She walked home with the flour sack on her hip and her face perfectly still. That was Mercy. She had learned long ago never to let strangers see her cry. When Silas came in, she didn't say a word. She set out the supper. She poured the milk. She watched her husband eat with that quiet way he had, chewing slow, not looking up. And she felt something she had not felt in 2 winters. She felt afraid. She felt afraid because she did not understand the man she had married anymore. She felt afraid because all the money was gone, and the children's shoes were thin, and Elspeth still coughed at night. But she also felt something else, something underneath the fear. She felt curious. Silas Kohler had never been a foolish man. In all the years she had known him, he had never spent $1 without weighing it 3 times. He did not gamble. He did not drink. He did not chase wild schemes. So if Silas had bought a pile of rocks, there had to be a reason. She waited until after the children were in bed. She waited until the lamp was low. Then she sat down across from him at the table. "Tell me," she said. Silas looked up. His eyes were tired. He said, "Stone remembers mercy. Stone remembers what wood forgets." She didn't understand. Not yet. But she reached across the table and put her hand on top of his hand. And she said, "All right." That was all. Just all right. And friends, I want you to know that was the bravest thing Mercy Kohler had done in 5 years, because she did it not knowing. She did it not understanding. She did it because the man she married had asked her to believe him one more time. Sometimes love is exactly that, believing one more time when you have every reason not to. The next morning, Mercy walked the 2 miles into Stillwater Hollow alone. She had a basket on her arm. She told Silas she needed thread. What she really needed was Augusta. Augusta Pendry was the closest thing Stillwater Hollow had to a town mother. She was 62 years old. She had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 winters in a sod house before she finally settled in town. She was by some unspoken vote the preacher at the small white church on the south end of the main street. The previous reverend had died of a fever in 1881. The men of the town had argued for 6 weeks about who to bring in to replace him. While they argued, Augusta Pendry had simply opened the church on Sundays and started preaching. By the time the men had agreed on a candidate, half the town said they wouldn't go to hear anyone else. Augusta was not officially ordained. She did not care. Mercy found her at the little parsonage behind the church, sweeping the porch. "Augusta, can I sit with you a minute?" "Sit yourself down, honey." Mercy sat. The morning sun warmed the boards. Augusta finished her sweeping and then settled in the chair across from her with the kind of slowness that meant she had nowhere else to be. Mercy didn't know how to start, so she started in the middle. "Augusta, I think I have forgotten how to trust my husband." Augusta nodded once. She did not look shocked. She did not look sad. She just nodded. Mercy went on. "He spent every cent we have on a pile of rocks. He won't tell me what he means to do with it. He just says stone remembers. Augusta, I don't know if I'm angry with him or scared of him or both." Augusta sat for a long moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the long grass. The sun moved another inch across the boards. Then Augusta said, "Mercy, I'm going to tell you something my grandmother told me. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is choosing to stay even when the doubt is loud." Mercy looked at her. "You don't have to know what Silas is doing," Augusta said. "You only have to decide if you are going to stay beside him while he does it." Mercy's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. "I've already decided," she whispered. "Then the only thing left to do is wait," Augusta said. "And waiting, my dear, is a kind of work all its own." Mercy nodded. She stood up. She thanked Augusta. She walked home with thread she did not need, and a heart that felt for the first time in months slightly less heavy. She did not know it yet, but that was the conversation that would carry her through everything to come. Now, while Mercy was finding her courage, Silas was meeting a man he did not expect to meet. He had spent 2 days clearing sagebrush from the inside of the old fort when an old man on a gray mule came up the rise. The old man wore a faded blue coat that might have been a Union jacket once a long time ago. His beard was white and his hands were knotted with years. He stopped his mule near the corner where Silas was working. He sat there a long time without saying a word. Finally, he said, "I knew your father, son." Silas straightened up slowly. His shovel hung loose in his hand. "My name is Harlan Dietz," the old man said. "Heinrich Kohler and I served together in '62, Fort Benton, then down to this very ruin you are standing in." Silas could not speak. "I figured you didn't know," Harlan said. "Your father was a private man, but he was a good man, and he had hands that understood stone better than any officer's instructions." Harlan got down off the mule. His knees popped. He walked to the southern wall and put his hand against it. "I helped build this fort, son, in 1862. 22 of us. Officers from Mexico had taught us a trick that the Army engineers did not know about. A drainage system, double-sloped, crushed shale under the footing, dipping two ways." He looked at Silas. "Most of those 22 men died of fever in the spring of '63. The Army boarded the fort up and called it cursed. They left the walls because nobody could be paid enough to tear them down. People in town still say there are ghosts here." He smiled with very few teeth. "There aren't any ghosts, just stone that remembers a job done properly." Silas swallowed hard. "My father died in a kiln collapse in 1865. "I know it. I sent flowers." The two men stood in silence for a long while. Then Harlan said very quietly, "Your father told me once that if I ever met his son, I was to make sure the boy didn't forget what stone could do. I'm an old man, Silas. I've been waiting a long time for you to show up on this rise." Silas couldn't answer. Harlan got back on his mule. "I'll come by from time to time, son. There are things you'll want to know before winter. Things I doubt your father had the chance to teach you." He turned the mule and rode back down the rise. Silas stood for a long time with one hand on the cold stone. The sun was warm on the other side of the wall. He pressed his palm flat against it. The stone was warmer than it had any right to be. And friends, that was the first moment Silas truly believed he was going to be able to save his family. The trouble started faster than he expected. By the end of May, the whole basin knew about the fort. 3 men came up the rise on horseback one afternoon to see for themselves. The first was Jonas Bridger. He was 52, the most respected carpenter in Stillwater Hollow. If a family wanted a cabin that would survive 10 winters, they asked Jonas before they drove the first nail. He had a wife named Adele, who had been sickly for 3 winters running, and a quiet way about him that suggested he carried things he did not say. The second was Wendell Marsh, the sawmill owner. The third was Royce Tatum. Royce was 40. He was the foreman of the largest cattle operation in the basin, owned by an absent man back in St. Louis. Royce had a wife and a 14-year-old son, and a grin that made him popular at the saloon, and unpopular almost everywhere else. Silas was kneeling beside a shallow mixing pit when they rode up. He was blending lime clay, crushed shale, and dry buffalo grass fibers into mortar. He carried a trowelful to the wall and pressed it carefully into a gap between 2 stones. Jonas spoke first. He was not unkind. "Silas, stone belongs under a house, not around it. Those walls are going to pull every bit of warmth right out of your fire." Silas didn't answer. He kept working. Wendell tried a different approach. "You spent everything you had on this. I've got perfectly good lumber 3 miles back. Winter's coming whether you're ready or not." Royce Tatum grinned. "Well, if he finishes the thing, folks can always store ice in it. Looks like Kohler's cold box to me." The 2 other men laughed. Jonas didn't laugh, but he didn't stop them either. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. He stood up. The afternoon sun was on the south wall. He put his palm flat against it. He held it there a moment. He looked at the 3 men. He said, "This wall keeps yesterday alive." That was all. Just that one line. He picked up his trowel and went back to work. The three men stared at him for a long moment. Then they turned their horses and rode back to town. By supper time, the nickname had reached every saloon and every porch in Stillwater Hollow. Kohler's cold box. Royce Tatum told the story 16 times that night. Each time it got better. Sometimes the fort had no roof. Sometimes Silas was planning to live in it like a badger. Sometimes he was building a tomb for his whole family. The laughter spread like a fire in dry grass. And the next morning, Mercy Kohler went to the general store. She did not know yet what was waiting for her. The store was busy. 3 women stood at the counter talking about flour prices. 2 more were over by the dry goods. One of those 2 was Mavis Tatum. Mavis was 38 years old, black hair, a face that had once been beautiful and was still handsome in the right light. She was Royce's wife, and once a long time ago in a town in Pennsylvania, neither of them had seen in 20 years. Mavis Tatum had been Mavis Hollins, and Mavis Hollins had been Mercy Holloway's best friend. The 2 of them had been girls together. They had braided each other's hair. They had shared secrets. They had sat together on the bank of the Susquehanna River the summer they were 16 and promised that no matter where life took them, they would always be sisters. Life had taken them both to Montana, different husbands, different roads. The friendship had thinned by the time their children were born and gone almost silent in the years since. But it had never quite died. Not on Mercy's side, anyway. Mercy walked into the store and saw Mavis at the counter. Her heart lifted a little, even after everything, even after the years. She smiled. Mavis did not smile back. Mavis Tatum turned her shoulder very deliberately toward the wall of canned goods. She lifted her chin. She pretended she had not seen Mercy at all. The other women noticed. One of them, a younger woman. Mercy did not know well, said in a voice meant to carry, "I hear that fort has ghosts from the soldiers who died in '63. My husband says it's no place to raise children." Another one said, "Some men just don't think about their wives." The store went very quiet. The clerk looked at the floor. Mercy stood there for what felt like a long time. Then she walked very slowly to the counter. She set her basket down. She asked for 2 pounds of cornmeal in a voice that did not shake. She paid. She thanked the clerk by name. And then she walked out of the store. She did not look at Mavis once. She walked the 2 miles home with the cornmeal on her hip and the wind in her face. She did not cry until she reached the cottonwood at the bottom of the lane. Then she stopped behind the tree, and she put her hand against the bark, and she let it out just for a minute, just long enough to be a woman and not a mother and not a wife. That night she sat by the window for a long time after Silas went to bed. She watched the lane. She kept thinking the wagon would come. She kept thinking Mavis would drive out alone the way she used to drive out when they were younger and one of them was hurting. She kept thinking there would be a knock on the door. No knock came. The wagon did not come up the lane that night. It did not come the next night either. And friends, if you have ever waited for a friend who did not call, you know how long those nights can be. The work on the fort began in earnest that June. Silas dug a shallow trench around the foundation. He lifted out the loose stones one at a time. He reset the largest ones near the ground where the weight mattered most. He mixed the lime mortar with the slow, careful patience of a man who has done a thing 1,000 times and means to do it right one more. Mercy carried water from Mossback Creek in wooden buckets. Her shoulders ached at the end of every day. She did not complain. Thaddeus Mercy called him Thad, though Silas called him by his full name, was 11 years old that summer. He was a wiry, sharp-eyed boy who reminded Mercy of her own father. He gathered smaller stones to fill the gaps. He kept a little notebook in his back pocket that he wrote in at night by candlelight. He would not let anyone read it. Elspeth was 7. The doctor in town had told Mercy that her daughter's lungs would either grow stronger as she got older, or they wouldn't. There was nothing in between. Elspeth sat on a blanket in the shade of the southern wall most afternoons. She watched her mother carry water. She held her small fingers up to the stones to feel which ones were warmest. And Copper, the brown hound. Copper found his place near the southern wall almost from the first week. He would sniff along the cracks. He would press his nose into the joints. He would settle finally in the spot where the afternoon sun lingered the longest. Silas watched him. Silas did not call him away. One evening, as the sun was setting, Mercy stood beside her husband and looked at the slow-rising walls. They had been working for 6 weeks. The progress was not dramatic. From a distance, you could almost convince yourself nothing had changed. She said, "Silas, tell me again." He took her hand. He pressed her palm against the warm stone of the southern wall. "Feel it." She felt it. The stone held the day. The way a body holds a memory. "That heat doesn't leave when the sun goes down," Silas said. "Not all of it. It stays, hour after hour, long after the wood would have gone cold." Mercy closed her eyes for a moment. "And when winter comes, the wall gives it back." She opened her eyes. She looked at him. For the first time since spring, she saw the man she had married, not the stranger. The man. She said very softly, "All right, Silas. All right. And friends, if you have ever stood beside the man you have loved for half your life and remembered for one moment exactly why you chose him, let me know in the comments. Hit subscribe while you are there. Mercy and Silas have a long road ahead, and I want you with me for all of it. Now I want to tell you about a boy named Thad. Thad Kohler came home from school the second week of June, with mud on his face and a tear in the sleeve of his shirt. He would not look at his mother. He went straight to the wash basin and scrubbed his face hard. Mercy watched him. She did not ask. Not right away. She had been a girl with brothers once. She knew the rule. She set out his supper. She gave him an extra biscuit. She waited. That night, after Elspeth was asleep and Silas was outside checking the mortar, Mercy sat down on the edge of Thad's bed. She put her hand on his hair. "Tell me." He did not answer. She waited. Finally he said, "The Tatum boy." That was all he would say. The Tatum boy. Garrett Tatum. Royce's son. 14 years old, almost a full head taller than Thad. Mercy had known Garrett since he was a baby. She had once held him on her lap while Mavis fed her own baby. That was long ago. Before everything. She said, "What did he do?" "Thaddeus." Thad shook his head, hard, like he did not want her to know. "He said our house is a grave," Thad finally whispered. "He said Pa is crazy. He said Elspeth is going to die in it." Mercy's hand stilled on her son's hair. "And then?" Thad did not answer. He turned his face to the wall. She did not push. She sat with him until his breathing slowed. Then she pulled the blanket up to his chin and she went outside. She walked past Silas without speaking. She walked all the way out to the cottonwood at the bottom of the lane. And there, in the dark, with no one to see her, she let herself feel what she could not feel in the cabin. She was furious. Furious in a way she had not been since she was a young woman. She was furious at Royce Tatum, who had taught his son to laugh at hurting children. She was furious at Mavis, who had let it happen. She was furious at the whole town that had decided her husband was a fool and her family was a joke. But most of all, she was furious at herself. Because she had been a schoolteacher once, she had taught children in this very basin. Garrett Tatum's older sister had been one of her students. The young woman who taught the children now had been one of her students. Mercy had taught a whole generation, and what had they learned from her that they could now turn on her son? She stood under the cottonwood for a long time. Then she walked back to the cabin. She did not tell Silas what had happened. She knew her husband. If he heard, he would walk to the Tatum place that night, and there would be blood by morning. Some things a mother carries alone. The next morning she walked to the schoolhouse. The teacher was 23 years old. Her name was Loretta Mund. She had been Mercy's student 8 years before, a quiet child with a serious face. She was a quiet woman now with the same serious face. Loretta looked up when Mercy came through the door. Her face changed. She remembered. "Mrs. Kohler." "Loretta, walk outside with me a moment." They walked behind the schoolhouse. Mercy did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "My son came home yesterday with a torn shirt. He won't say what happened. But the Tatum boy was involved." Loretta's eyes filled. "I didn't see it, Mrs. Kohler. I was inside. By the time I came out, I know you didn't see it. That isn't what I came to talk to you about." Loretta waited. Mercy said, "I taught you for 2 years, Loretta. Do you remember what I taught you on the very first day of school?" Loretta's mouth trembled. You taught us that the small ones are the responsibility of the big ones." "And what does that mean, Loretta?" "It means we look after each other." Mercy nodded once. "This basin is going through something hard right now, Loretta. People are saying ugly things about my husband, about my house. Children listen, children imitate. If you do not stop the Tatum boy from putting his hands on my son, I am going to come back here, and I am going to teach this school myself, for free, and I am going to do it standing in your place. Do you understand me?" Loretta nodded. She was crying now. Mercy softened. She put her hand on the younger woman's arm. "I taught you better than this, honey. I taught all of you better than this. You have the power to stop it. Use it." She turned and walked back home. "Now, friends, before we go on, I want you to take a breath. Sit back a moment. Because what is coming next is the part of the story where everything that has been growing under the surface, all the resentment, all the silence, all the cold, comes out into the open. If you are still with me, hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment in your life when you had to speak up to protect someone you love? I want to hear it. Because what Mercy did at the schoolhouse, that was a small thing. But sometimes the small things are how women change a town. We are just getting started. Stay with me. The summer turned hot and dry. By the middle of July, the walls of the old fort stood roughly 4 feet high again, all the way around. Silas had reset every stone in the foundation. The new mortar was harder than the old. The southern wall faced the afternoon sun, and Silas had put his ear to it more than once when he thought nobody was watching the way a man listens for a heartbeat. He still had work to do. The walls had to come up another 4 feet, then the cottonwood beams, then the sagebrush lattice, then the sawed roof, 14 inches of it, packed tight, blending into the rise. He had until the first hard freeze, October if they were lucky, September if they were not. He was running out of money for materials. The lime he had purchased in May was nearly gone. He needed more. Good lime, not the cheap kind that crumbled in the joints. He rode into town one afternoon to talk to Wendell Marsh. Wendell had a stockpile of building lime at the sawmill hauled in from a kiln up near Helena. Silas needed 40 pounds. He did not have the cash. He asked Wendell for credit until October. He would pay back at 15% interest. He gave his word as a Kohler. Wendell looked at him for a long moment across the office counter. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical one. He said, "Silas, I respect you. I do. But the whole basin is laughing at your project. If I extend you credit and your house falls down in November, I look like a fool. And I cannot afford to look like a fool. My customers won't trust my judgment." Silas nodded. "I understand." He turned to leave. Wendell said, "Silas, wait." Silas stopped. "There is something else you should know. I heard a man at the saloon last night. He said your project, if it works, would be bad for business. Said if folks figure out they don't need as much lumber, the sawmill might not make it through next winter." Silas turned around slowly. "Who said that?" Wendell hesitated. Royce Tatum. Silas looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he said, Thank you, Wendell. He walked out. He rode home. He did not tell Mercy what he had learned. Not yet. He told himself it was to protect her. He would learn in time that protection and silence are not always the same thing. But that night, while Mercy was putting Elspeth to bed, Silas sat down at the table with old Harlan Dietz. The old man had ridden up at sunset. Silas said very quietly, Royce Tatum has a reason to want me to fail, beyond a laugh. Harlan nodded slowly. I figured. Royce gets a percentage on every board foot of lumber sold to families in this basin. The cattle operation pays him by the contract. He helps keep folks dependent on the sawmill. If your method spreads, he loses money. Silas closed his eyes. Harlan, I cannot afford lime. I have to make my own. From the limestone up on the ridge. Harlan smiled with very few teeth. That I can help you with. The next 2 weeks nearly broke them all. Silas built a small kiln up on the ridge above the rise. He and Thad hauled limestone in a wagon 1 load at a time. They burned the stone for 4 days and 4 nights. Mercy carried meals up the ridge to her husband and her son. She slept in the wagon some nights to be near them. Elspeth stayed with Augusta Pendry during those weeks. Augusta had insisted, You cannot mind a sick child and a husband and a kiln at the same time, Mercy. Let the child come to me. Mercy had cried a little when she left her daughter at the parsonage. Elspeth had patted her hand and said, Mama, I'll be all right. Reverend Pendry sings nice. Augusta had stood at the door and watched Mercy walk down the lane. Then she had taken Elspeth into the kitchen and made her a cup of warm milk with honey. And she had asked very gently what the little girl knew about the new house. Elspeth had said, Papa says the wall remembers. Mama believes him now. Augusta had smiled. The first batch of lime was good. Not as fine as the kiln in Helena, but good enough. Silas hauled it down to the rise. He resumed work on the upper courses of the wall, and that was when the sabotage began. The first time was the 3rd week of August. Mercy woke in the middle of the night to copper barking, hard, deep barks, the kind of barking that meant a stranger. Silas was already out of bed. He went outside with a lantern. Mercy followed at the door with the rifle. There was nothing in the yard, but the next morning when Silas walked up to the fort, he found a fresh course of stones along the western wall had been shifted out of place. The mortar was still soft enough that the damage had not set. He could fix it. He fixed it without a word. The second time was a week later. Copper barked again. Silas was faster this time. He saw a shape running across the field, away into the dark. The shape was small, too small to be a grown man. He did not say anything. Not yet. The third time he was ready. He had not gone to bed at all that night. He had been sitting in the dark on the south side of the fort, with Copper beside him. The wind was low. The moon was 3/4 full. A figure came up over the rise just after midnight. Silas waited. Copper waited. The figure crept to the western wall. The figure had a wooden mallet in his hand. He raised it. Silas stood up. Put it down, boy. The figure froze. It was Garrett Tatum, 14 years old, tall and thin, wearing his father's old coat over his nightshirt. The mallet fell from his hand. He turned to run. Copper was on him before he made it 3 strides. The dog did not bite. Copper had never bitten a soul in his life. He just stood in the way. Silas walked over. The boy was breathing hard. His face was white in the moonlight. He was crying without knowing he was crying. Silas looked at him for a long moment. He said, Does your father know you are here? The boy shook his head. Silas nodded once. He picked up the mallet. He handed it back to the boy. Go home, Garrett, and do not come back here. If I see you on this rise again, I am going to your mother. Not your father. Your mother. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded. He turned. He ran. Silas stood there a long time after the boy was gone. Copper sat beside his leg. The moon traveled across the sky. He did not tell Mercy what had happened. He thought he was protecting her. He was wrong, because Mercy, lying awake in the cabin, had heard the dog. And Mercy, with the eyes of a mother who had been pushed to her limit, had stood at the window and seen the small figure of a boy run across the moonlit field toward the road that led to the Tatum place. She had recognized that running. She had watched that boy take his first steps once in another life on another porch, with Mavis sitting beside her. She knew exactly who it was. And the next morning, Mercy Kohler did something she had been waiting 8 years to do. She put on her good dress. She brushed her hair. She walked the 4 miles to the Tatum place. She did not tell Silas where she was going. She knocked on Mavis Tatum's door at 10 o'clock in the morning. Mavis opened the door. Her eyes went wide. The color drained from her face. She started to close the door. Mercy put her hand against it. "Mavis, I am not here about Royce. I am not here about the basin. I am not here about any of it." Mavis stood with her hand on the door. Her chin was shaking. Mercy said, "Mavis, your boy came to my house last night." Mavis's hand went to her mouth. Mercy went on. "He tried to take a mallet to our wall. He has been doing it for 2 weeks. My husband caught him. My husband did not hurt him. My husband sent him home. I did not come to tell Royce. I came to tell you." Mavis Tatum sank against the door frame. She made a sound that was not quite a word. Mercy did not move. After a long moment, Mavis whispered, "Come in. Please, come in." Mercy walked into the Tatum kitchen for the first time in 7 years. The kitchen was clean, bright curtains, a pot of coffee on the stove. Mavis sat down at the table. She put her face in her hands. Mercy sat across from her. She waited. Mavis said into her hands, I knew something was wrong with Garrett. I did not know what." Mercy did not answer. Mavis lifted her face. Her eyes were red. "Mercy, Mercy, I have done you so wrong." Mercy said nothing. "I turned my shoulder to you in the store. I let those women say what they said. I went home that night and I cried mercy. I cried like a child, and I told myself I would write to you. I have written you a letter every Sunday since May. I have not sent one of them." Mercy felt the tears come up. She did not let them spill yet. She said, "Mavis." "Why?" Mavis took a long breath. "Because I am ashamed." Mercy waited. Mavis said, "Royce drinks. You know that. The whole town knows that. He drinks and he gets cruel. Not to Garrett. Garrett is his son and he loves Garrett the only way he knows how. But to me, Mercy, he gets cruel to me." Mercy reached across the table. Mavis said very softly, "There was a night in 1879, Mercy. A night I have never spoken of to a living soul. I lost a child that night. I have never told anyone why." She did not say more. She did not need to. Mercy understood. The 2 women sat in the kitchen for a long time. Mercy held Mavis's hand across the table. Finally, Mercy said, "Mavis Hollins, do you remember the bank of the Susquehanna?" Mavis laughed, a small, broken laugh. "I remember. Do you remember what we promised?" Mavis nodded. "That girl is still in you, Mavis. That girl is still in there." They cried then, both of them. The kind of crying that is not loud and is not pretty and is not the kind they show in pictures. The kind that 2 grown women do when they finally let go of something they have been carrying for years. After a long while, Mavis wiped her face. She said, "Mercy, I cannot stand up against my husband in this town. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I am not strong enough." Mercy said, "I am not asking you to." "What are you asking me?" "Just one thing. Keep Garrett away from our rise. That is all." Mavis nodded. She nodded again. She squeezed Mercy's hand. "I will," she said. "Mercy, I will. He will not come back, I promise you, as long as I have breath." Mercy stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned around. "Mavis, the letters, the unsent ones." Mavis looked up. Mercy said, "Send them. Send all of them. I'll read every one." She walked home. She walked the 4 miles back to the rise. She did not tell Silas where she had been. But that evening, as the sun set behind the western ridge, she stood beside her husband at the southern wall. She pressed her palm against the warm stone. She closed her eyes. She felt something she had not felt in years. She felt forgiven. Not of any one thing. Just forgiven. And friends, if there is a woman in your life, you have lost touch with a woman whose name you still remember, a friendship you let go because of a thing you could not even name. Now I want you to do something for me. Tell me her name in the comments. Just her name. Sometimes saying a name out loud after years of silence is the first stone in a wall that can still be rebuilt. We are not done yet. Not even close. Stay with me. September brought the first frost. It came on a Tuesday morning, silvery and quiet. The grass crunched underfoot. Elspeth woke up coughing, but only once. She drank her warm milk and ate her oatmeal and went back to sleep. Silas worked on the roof. He had finished the walls. They stood 8 feet high now, 24 inches thick, with a smooth interior face and a slightly battered exterior that shed water. The corners were square. The mortar had cured hard. The southern wall on a sunny day held warmth into the night. Now came the part the town would mock the loudest. Most settlers built upward. Silas built downward. He laid heavy cottonwood beams across the top of the walls. He covered them with a lattice of dried sagebrush, then prairie grass, then sod, 14 inches of it cut from the rise itself, fitted into place like the pieces of a puzzle. The finished house looked like part of the hillside. From 100 yards out, you almost could not see it. It blended into the land. It seemed to sink into the rise. Mavis Tatum sent her first letter that month. It was 4 pages long. It was an apology that did not ask forgiveness. Mercy read it twice and put it in the drawer where she kept her mother's lace. A second letter came the next Sunday. A third the Sunday after that. Mercy wrote back. She did not write long letters. She wrote short ones, 3 or 4 sentences each. "I read what you wrote. I am thinking about it. Elspeth slept through the night." The letters traveled by way of Augusta Pendry, who carried them in her basket from one woman to the other without ever once asking what they said. And on the second Sunday of September, Augusta Pendry stood in her pulpit at the little white church, and she preached a sermon that the town did not forget. She preached on the widow of Zarephath. It is an old story, friends, and many of you know it. There is a woman in a famine. She has only a little flour and a little oil. She is gathering sticks to bake her last loaf for herself and her son before they starve. A stranger comes and asks her to share, and she does. She shares the last of what she has, and the flour does not run out, and the oil does not run dry. They are sustained, all of them, through the famine. Augusta did not say the name Kohler once in her sermon. She did not have to. Every person in the church knew exactly who she was preaching about. She said, "There is a family on a rise above Mossback Creek who has spent the last of their flour and the last of their oil on something none of you understand. You have laughed at them. You have turned your shoulders. Some of you have done worse." She paused. "I will not tell you to apologize. That is between you and your God. But I will tell you this. The widow of Zarephath did not save the prophet. The prophet saved her, and neither of them saved each other. The Lord saved them both through the act of one woman opening her door to a stranger when she had nothing left to give." She looked around the church. There is a woman in this town who has nothing left to give, and she is still giving. You think about that this week. You think hard. The congregation walked out in silence. That Tuesday, a wagon came up the rise to the Kohler place. Silas was on the roof. Mercy was in the yard. A boy from the sawmill drove the wagon. He climbed down. He unloaded a heavy sack from the back, 40 pounds of building lime, from a kiln in Helena. The best kind. There was no note. There was no signature. Mercy looked at the sawmill boy. The boy would not meet her eyes. He climbed back up on the wagon. He turned the team around. He drove back down the lane. She stood there with the sack at her feet for a long while. Then she turned and looked up at her husband on the roof. Silas was watching her. He did not say a word, but he took off his hat, and he held it against his chest for a moment. The roof was finished by the last week of September. Inside the house was 24 feet by 38. Two small windows set deep into the thick stone walls faced southeast. The entrance opened away from the worst northern winds. The stone hearth was built directly against the northern wall, so that every fire would feed warmth into the masonry itself. It was not a beautiful house. From outside you might have called it grim. But inside the air was still. There were no drafts. The floor was packed earth smooth as a tabletop. The hearth glowed. The family moved in the first week of October. Mercy stood in the center of the main room on the first night. She turned slowly in a circle. She looked at the thick walls. She looked at her husband. She said, "Silas, it feels like a held breath." He smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him since spring. He said, "Now we wait for winter." Old Harlan Dietz rode up the rise on the first day of October. He stood in the yard with his hand against the south wall for a long time. He nodded once. Then he turned to Silas. His old face was very serious. "Son, the clouds I am seeing this week, I have not seen those clouds since '62. The year the fever killed my unit. The year your father and I almost died of cold in this very fort." He looked toward the northern sky. "It is not going to be a normal winter, Silas. Be ready." He rode away. Silas hung 2 thermometers inside the house that night, one by the door, one by the hearth. He started keeping a notebook. Temperature at sunset, temperature before dawn. How much wood burned, how long the coals stayed alive under the ashes, where copper chose to sleep. Mercy looked over his shoulder one evening as he wrote. She said, "You are keeping records of the dog now." He closed the notebook. He said, "A dog does not flatter a wall." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months. Now, friends, if you are still with me, you are the kind of listener Mercy would have welcomed at her table. Let me ask you something. Have you ever learned something important from someone you never got to thank? A teacher, a neighbor, a mother who has been gone for years? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. The names of the people who shaped us, they deserve to be said. The cold came slowly through October, then faster through November. By the first week of December, frost held the ground all day. The creek froze. The cottonwoods went silver. And then in the last days of December, the storm came. It came down from the Canadian north without warning. One day the basin was merely cold. The next, the world was white. Wind swept across the open country without interruption. Snow drove sideways through the air until you could not see a fence post 10 feet in front of you. The thermometer at the old postal station read 34 below zero, then 36 below, then 38. The cottonwoods cracked in the dark like rifle shots. Cattle stood with their backs to the wind for hours. Their eyes froze, their muzzles iced over. Inside the cabins of Stillwater Hollow, families dragged their beds close to the stoves. They burned wood faster than they had ever burned it. Frost grew on the inside of every window. Water buckets froze near the exterior walls. Children slept in their coats. Jonas Bridger's wife, Adele, could not get warm. She had been sickly for 3 winters. Jonas piled 4 blankets on her. He fed the fire every hour. He sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand. He did not sleep for 3 nights. Inside the Tatum cabin, Mavis sat by the wood box and watched her son, Garrett. The boy had been quiet since August. He had not asked any questions. He had simply done his chores and eaten his meals and looked at his mother sometimes the way he used to look at her when he was small. Royce was out. He had been at the saloon when the storm started. He had not come home. On the 4th night of the storm, Garrett began to shiver. By the 5th night, he was burning with fever. His chest rattled when he breathed. Mavis knew that sound. She had heard it in Stillwater Hollow before. 3 children had died of that sound the winter of 1880. She had buried one of them, her best friend's nephew. She remembered the small box. She wrapped Garrett in every blanket she had. She built the fire as high as it would go. The fire did not help. The cold in the cabin was inside the walls now. It had been inside the walls for 2 days. Garrett's lips were turning blue. Mavis stood in the middle of her cabin. She put her hand against her mouth. She thought about Royce. She did not know where he was. He might be dead in a drift. She did not know. She thought about Augusta Pendry, 2 miles away in town. 2 miles through that wind. Garrett would not survive the journey. She thought about her sister back in Pennsylvania. She thought about every place she might run, every door. And then she thought of one door. It was 3 miles east, across an open field that the wind was scouring like a knife. The door of a house she had been told had no warmth. A house she had laughed at. A house her son had tried to break. A house built of stone. She did not let herself think any longer. She wrapped Garrett in her own heavy coat. She wrapped him again in a quilt. She put on every garment she could find. She tied a scarf across her face. She picked her son up in her arms. He was 14 taller than she was, but the fever had made him light, and she walked out into the storm. Friends, I want you to picture this woman. 38 years old, black hair, a face that had once been beautiful, walking through a Montana blizzard at 36 below zero, carrying her sick son, going to the only door she could think of. The wind tried to take her 3 times. The first time she went down on one knee. She got up. The second time she went down on both knees. She got up. The third time she dropped Garrett. He landed in a drift and did not move. She had to crawl on her hands and knees to find him in the snow. She found him. She lifted him again. She walked on. It took her almost 2 hours to cross those 3 miles. She lost her sense of time. She lost the feeling in her feet. She walked because she did not know how to do anything else. When she came up over the rise above Mossback Creek, she almost could not find the house. It blended into the snow. It looked like a piece of the hillside. A single thin column of smoke rose from a stone chimney. That was how she found it. The smoke. She stumbled to the door. She could not feel her hands well enough to knock. She used her elbow. She fell against the door. Garrett slid down her body into the snow. The door opened. Mercy Kohler stood in the doorway with a lamp in her hand. Her hair was down for the night. She was in her nightgown and her wool shawl. She looked at the woman in the snow. She looked at the boy at the woman's feet. Mercy did not say a single word. She knelt down. She lifted Garrett under his arms. Silas was suddenly behind her, lifting the boy by his legs. Together they carried him into the warm dark of the stone house. Mercy turned back and reached out one hand to Mavis. Mavis took it. She came inside. The door closed behind them. Inside the house, the air was still. It was not hot. It was not roaring. It was steady. The hearth glowed but did not blaze. Elspeth slept under a single wool blanket without her coat. Thad sat up on his pallet, eyes wide. Mercy and Silas laid Garrett on a heavy quilt near the southern wall. Mercy stripped off his frozen outer clothes. She rubbed his hands. She rubbed his feet. Silas brought warm broth from the pot that always sat at the back of the hearth. Mavis stood in the doorway, dripping melted snow on the packed earth floor, unable to move. Mercy looked up at her old friend. She said, "Mavis, come here." Mavis came. The two women knelt beside the boy together. They did not speak for a long while. They worked. They got the broth into him a spoonful at a time. They got the color back into his hands. The fever did not break that would take all night, but the deadly chill came out of him. Around 3 in the morning, Garrett opened his eyes. He looked at Mavis. He looked at Mercy. He looked at the stone wall behind her, the southern wall, the one he had tried to break. He understood. He did not speak. He could not. But tears slid down his face into the quilt. Mercy put her hand on his hair. She said very softly, "It's all right, Garrett. You sleep now. You are safe here." He closed his eyes. He slept. Mercy and Mavis sat on either side of him until dawn. At some point, Mercy reached across the boy and took Mavis's hand. They did not speak. They just sat. The thermometer by the door read 51 degrees. Outside, the wind howled at 36 below, and the stone wall behind them held the warmth of every fire that had burned in that house since October, every fire that the family had built, every coal that had ever glowed. It held the warmth, and it gave it back, just the way Heinrich Kohler had told his son it would 21 years before in a Colorado lime kiln. Stone remembers. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th day. It went quiet the way Montana storms do. The wind dropped off in an hour. The sun came out. The world looked new and cold and white. Royce Tatum rode up the rise around noon. He had spent 4 nights in the back of Augusta Pendry's parsonage, where he had stumbled when he could not find his own way home in the storm. Augusta had given him hot broth and a cot, and a Bible he had not opened in 15 years. He had opened it on the 3rd night. He rode up to the Kohler place on a borrowed horse. He climbed down. He took off his hat at the door. Silas opened the door. Royce did not look at Silas. He looked past him. He looked at his wife sitting by the hearth with Garrett's head in her lap. Garrett was awake. The fever had broken in the night. Royce stood in the doorway. He was a 40-year-old man who had laughed at this house for 6 months. He was a man who had taught his son to laugh too. He was a man who had hurt his wife in ways he had never made right. He stood in the doorway and his face crumpled. He said, "Mavis." Mavis did not get up. She said, "Royce, sit down." He sat down on a stool by the door. He held his hat in his hands. He looked at the floor. He said, "I did not know where you were." She said, "I know." He said, "I thought you had died." She said, "I know." There was a long silence. Royce said, "Mercy, I owe you my son's life." Mercy did not answer immediately. Then she said, "You owe him to your wife. She carried him 3 miles in the storm." Royce nodded. He could not look at any of them. Mavis spoke then, quietly, without anger. She said, "Royce, we are going to talk, you and I, but not today. Today I am going to take our son home with Silas's help in his wagon, and you are going to walk back to town, because you have a great deal to think about, and the walk will help." Royce did not argue. He nodded. He stood. He put his hat back on. He walked out of the house. Mavis watched him go down the rise. Royce walked just as she had told him to. He grew smaller against the white field until he was only a dark stitch on the snow. Then Mavis turned to Mercy. She put her face in her hands. Mercy went to her old friend. She put her arms around her. She did not say it was going to be all right. She did not say anything that was not true. She just held her. Outside, Garrett slept on the quilt by the southern wall. Inside Mavis's chest, something that had been frozen for 9 winters began very slowly to thaw. They held each other for a long time. Now, friends, if you are still with me, take a breath here. We are nearly at the end, and I want you to be present for it. Because what comes next is the part of the story that the town never quite expected. Have you ever had to forgive someone before they asked? Have you ever opened a door to a person who had hurt you just because the moment demanded it? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. The story spread, but not in the way you might expect. It did not start with Jonas Bridger, though Jonas did come up the rise on the second day after the storm broke. He came under the pretext of searching for a lost horse. He stumbled against the south wall of the stone house. He put his bare hand against it. Friends, the temperature outside that morning was 26 below. The stone under his hand was not warm. It was not warm the way a stove is warm. But the bitter killing cold he expected, the way stone usually bit at a hand in that weather, was not there. The stone seemed to be holding something, a trace, a memory of every fire that had ever burned inside. He stood there a long time with his hand against the wall. Then he walked to the door and knocked. Silas let him in. There was no roaring fire to greet him. The interior was steady. The air did not move. Adele Bridger would have wept to feel air like this. He saw the wood piles smaller than it ought to have been after a week like the one just passed. He saw Mercy slicing bread at the table. He saw Elspeth playing with a corn-husk doll on the floor, not coughing. He saw copper stretched out near the southern wall 6 feet from the hearth. Silas, without a word, handed him the notebook. Jonas Bridger read it for a long time, page by page. Temperature outside, temperature inside, wood burned, coals at dawn, dog position. When he closed the notebook, he had tears in his eyes. He said, "Silas, I owe you an apology, and I owe my wife a house." He left. But it did not start with Jonas. It started with Mavis. 3 days after the storm broke, the general store was crowded. People were trading stories. Wendell Marsh was already calculating spring lumber orders for the families whose cabins had not done well in the cold. Royce Tatum was not there. He had not been seen at the saloon since the storm. A man named Albin Bauer was at the counter. Bauer was a homestead foreman with a grin that traveled faster than the mail. He had been one of the loudest voices in the saloon back in October, repeating Royce Tatum's jokes word for word. He saw an opening now for one more. He said with a grin, "I suppose Kohler's cold box didn't freeze solid after all." A few men chuckled. Not as many as in October. The bell over the door rang. Mavis Tatum walked in. She was wearing a clean dress. Her hair was up. There were dark circles under her eyes, but her back was straight. The store went very quiet. Mavis walked up to the counter. She did not look at Albin Bauer. She did not look at any of the women. She looked at Wendell Marsh. She said in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the store, "Wendell, I came to tell you what happened on the night of the storm." She told them. She did not speak of Royce. She did not speak of bottles or old wounds. She spoke only of one thing. She said, "My son was dying. There was no door in Stillwater Hollow I could reach in that wind except one. And when I knocked on it, Mercy Kohler opened it and did not ask a single question. She took my boy in her arms. She and her husband worked through the night to save him. They fed him broth from a pot that was still warm at 4 in the morning. The water in their bucket was not frozen. My boy slept under a single blanket and woke alive." She paused. She said, "Garrett, my son, once did harm to that house. He did it because he had been taught to laugh at it. I will live the rest of my life knowing that my boy almost died on a night when, if he had been 1 mile further from that stone house, he would not have come home. That family did not ask for an apology. They did not ask for anything. They just opened the door." She looked around the store. Her eyes stopped on Alban Bauer. "That is what I know about the cold box," she said. Alban Bauer looked at the floor. Mavis bought her flour. She paid. She walked out. The store was silent for a full minute after the bell rang above the door, and from the back where she had been quietly examining a bolt of cloth and listening with great interest, Augusta Pendry, 62 years old, two husbands buried the unofficial preacher of Stillwater Hollow, smiled to herself and went back to her shopping. Spring came slowly to Stillwater Hollow. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first. Mud replaced the drifts. Wagons cut new tracks through roads that had been buried for months. People talked about the winter often that year. Not because it had been unusual, winters in Montana were always cruel. They talked about it because something had been settled. Mavis and Royce talked the way Mavis had said they would. Not that night, not the next week, but across the long February with Augusta Pendry sitting in their kitchen more often than Mavis would have once allowed. And in the end, Mavis made a choice. She did not throw her husband out. She did not stay silent either. She told him he had two roads in front of him and only one of them led back to her door. Mavis Tatum sent Royce away to a brother in Iowa for 6 months. When he came back, he was not the same man. He was not a perfect man, but he was a quieter man, and he did not drink anymore, and he never raised his hand to Mavis again. Some things do change, friends. Slowly. Not all the way, but enough. Jonas Bridger built his wife Adele a new house that summer. He did not tear down the old cabin. He built a stone addition against the northern wall 20 inches thick, with a hearth that fed warmth into the masonry. He called it Adele's room. Adele lived 7 more winters in that house. She had not been expected to live one. Wendell Marsh sold less lumber for walls that year and more for roofs and floors. He adjusted. Practical men do. Augusta Pendry preached every Sunday until she was 78. She did not preach about the Kohlers again. She did not need to. But the Sunday after Mavis told her story in the general store, Augusta read from the book of Ruth, the story of one woman saying to another, "Whither thou goest, I will go." She did not explain the choice of text. Half the women in the church were already crying before she reached the second verse. Garrett Tatum learned to lay stone. Silas Kohler taught him. The two of them, the man whose wall he had tried to break and the boy who had tried to break it, worked side by side every Saturday for 2 years. Garrett never spoke much. But the day he laid his first perfect course of stone, straight square level, he looked at Silas, and Silas looked back, and that was the end of a debt that had begun on a moonlit night in August. Thad Kohler kept his notebook. He grew up to be a writer. There is a book somewhere with his name on it, a book about a Montana valley and the winter that changed it. I have not read it in many years, but I remember the dedication. It said, "For my mother who opened the door." Elspeth Kohler lived. Her lungs grew stronger every winter in the stone house. By the time she was 12, she could run as far as any child in the basin. She married a doctor. She had 4 children of her own. Old Harlan Dietz lived to be 83. He died in his own bed in the spring of 1896. Silas was beside him at the end. Harlan did not say much. He just patted Silas on the hand and said, "Tell your father when you see him, tell him his boy did him proud." Silas Kohler lived another 21 years in the stone house. He never moved. He never built another. He fixed small cracks every spring and replaced sod on the roof every 5 years and watched the south wall hold the afternoon sun until the day he died. Mavis and Mercy never went a week without speaking again, not for the rest of their lives. And Copper, the brown hound. Copper lived 11 more years. He slept by the southern wall every night, 6 feet from the hearth, on a patch of packed earth that he had chosen on the first day of construction. A dog does not flatter a wall. The thinking spread. People called it the Kohler Wall. There were no printed plans. The knowledge moved the way frontier knowledge always moves one neighbor to another, a father to a son, a mother to a daughter. After 2 more winters, the families using stone features inspired by the Kohler place burned almost 40% less wood than their neighbors. By the 3rd winter, almost every new house in Stillwater Hollow had at least one stone wall on the northern side. But that is not the part of the story I wanted you to remember. What I wanted you to remember was a kitchen. A clean kitchen with bright curtains in August of 1884. 2 women across a table holding each other's hands. One of them had been laughed at. The other had laughed, and the one who had been laughed at said the simplest sentence I have ever heard. She said, "Mavis Hollins, do you remember the bank of the Susquehanna?" That's all. That was the wall that mattered. So, friends, before I let you go tonight, I want to leave you with one thing. Mercy Kohler never gave a speech in Stillwater Hollow. She never demanded an apology. She never stood in front of the town and told them what they had done to her family. She just opened her door on the coldest night of her life to a child who had wronged her, to a friend who had abandoned her, to a woman she had every reason to turn away. The walls that remember warmth are the ones we build with forgiveness we did not know we had. If you remember nothing else from tonight's story, remember that. And tell me in the comments, whose door would you knock on tonight if you could? Whose door would you open? Because there is still time. There is still time. Good night, friends. Sleep warm. The wall remembers.